Alright, so we are going to do what we did with the chapter on the musculoskeletal system. The next chapter that we have is on the circulatory system and the respiratory system, and those are two completely enormous chapters on their own, much less if you were to try to combine them together into one chapter. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to divide it up into two sets of lectures. The first set of probably about 4 lectures will be on the circulatory system, and then the second set of probably around 3 lectures is going to be on the respiratory system. So that way it should be divided up into some more manageable chunks of material that go together more, I guess, logically. So this is kind of the overall approach we're going to take. We're going to take a look kind of at the intro material on the functions of the circulatory system as a overall sort of a picture. We're going to go from there to look at the vertebrate heart. We're going to take a look at all the chambers and some of the valves and so forth associated with the vertebrate heart. We're going to go into a discussion of blood and the materials involved with blood. And then we're going to go into different blood vessels and finally talk about the lymphatic system and talk about exactly what that is and how it's involved, how it sort of pairs up with the circulatory system as well. So as far as functions of the circulatory system, there are several. One of them is to transport both oxygen and CO2. Obviously in the body, that's going to be kind of a big one. We want to transport gases in the body. There is going to be a distribution of nutrients. So any sort of breakdown products of digestion, whether it's amino acids or fatty acids or glucose or those kinds of things, can be distributed in the blood as well. There can be a transport of waste, so metabolic waste like urea, for example, and others can be transported in the blood until they can be either detoxified or filtered out of the blood by the kidneys, for example. There is a communication aspect, so everything we talked about with the endocrine system, those hormones as well as other substances have to be transported to their final destination, so typically that's going to involve the circulatory system. And there's also going to be a regulation of body temperature. So the blood can serve as both an insulator, in a sense, as well as a radiating sort of a function as far as moving blood out closer to the surface of the skin to help get rid of excess body heat. And then finally, there's a built-in repair mechanism. So if the circulatory system is compromised, if it's damaged, if there's a cut or if there's blood loss of some sort, the circulatory system is equipped to seal itself off and begin to repair those breaks, which is always kind of handy when you have an injury of some sort. And we also have apparently 2 number 6s here, but there's protection against disease. The circulatory system, the blood, also involves the use of immune cells. The primary basis of our discussion on the immune system is going to fall in this chapter as well. So we'll take a look at some of the immune cells involved with keeping us safe from various pathogens that we might experience. So next up, we're going to take a look at the vertebrate heart. And just for comparison's sake, I have on this picture, I have 3 different representations of 3 different hearts. The first one from a fish, the second one from amphibians, and most reptiles, with the exception of crocodilians, whose heart looks more like ours. And then finally, all the way on the right, we have a depiction of the mammalian and bird heart, which has 2 chambers on the top and also 2 chambers on the bottom. Overall, in general, the atria are involved in receiving blood from various parts of the body. Atria are where blood goes either from the rest of the body itself or from the lungs. So if we look over here on this picture, there is a right atrium and a left atrium over here in this picture. And again, it seems like it's backwards, right? This should be the left, this should be the right, but that's not the case. You always go from the patient's perspective. So if the owner of this heart were to be in the picture as well, this would indeed be the left side, and this would be the right side of the heart. So right atrium, right ventricle, left atrium, left ventricle. The ventricles are going to collect blood from the atria. In both cases, we have blood collected from the atria into the right and left ventricles. And the ventricles are also responsible for pumping that blood out to the rest of the body. So there's distribution of blood from the ventricles. What we didn't see in the fish heart, so if we take a look at what happens with the fish heart, we've got blood leaving from the heart, going to the gills, then going to the body, and then back to the heart. It's a single loop circulatory system. When you start getting into the realm of amphibians and reptiles and birds and mammals, there are actually 2 loops of circulation. So we see 1 loop up here at the top. We see a loop of circulation going from the right side of the heart over here, right atrium, right ventricle, out to the lungs, into the skin in the case of amphibians, back into the left atrium, the left ventricle, and then out to the rest of the body. So there are 2 separate loops. The loop between the heart and the lungs, in the case of mammals over here, the heart and the lungs, this would be what's called pulmonary circulation. And the circuit down here between the heart and the rest of the body is called systemic circulation. So two different separate circuits for blood. We have pulmonary and we have systemic circulation. Once lungs became more of a permanent feature in the vertebrate world, the second loop of circulation became especially important. So the pulmonary circuit, like I mentioned, moves blood from the heart and lungs, between the heart and lungs, and systemic circulation moves it between the heart and the rest of the body. And so now in this picture, we're starting to get a little bit more detail with our overall depiction of what the heart looks like. Again, just to kind of orient you here, we have right atrium. In this picture, we actually have a single ventricle. So this heart would be from either an amphibian, a turtle, a lizard, a snake, those sorts of things. All of those organisms have a three-chambered heart. So right atrium, left atrium, and then one and only one ventricle. If this was a bird, a mammal, or a crocodilian, alligator, those kinds of things, they're going to have right atrium, left atrium, and then there's going to be a division here between this one ventricle to produce a right ventricle and left ventricle to prevent mixing with oxygen-rich and oxygen-poor blood. We also see some chambers here. Now, these chambers, we have valves separating atria from ventricles, and atria from ventricles, and ventricle from pulmonary artery, and also a valve going from the single ventricle out to the aorta as well. So we have a four-chambered heart. The general pathway of blood flow is that blood coming in from the body is going to be relatively oxygen poor. It hasn't given up all of its oxygen. In reality, it's only given up maybe 20% of its oxygen, but it has given up some of the oxygen. That's going to go into the right atrium. From there, it's going to go past a valve, which we'll talk about more here in a second, exactly what valves go where. From the right atrium into the right ventricle, and then from the right ventricle out to the lungs via what's called the pulmonary artery. The left atrium is then going to receive blood from the lungs, and blood coming in from the lungs is going to be in a relatively oxygen-rich state, relatively saturated with oxygen, maybe up around 96-97% saturation, give or take, in a normal, healthy adult human being. The blood's going to go from the left atrium to the left ventricle, and then from there out via the aorta to the rest of the body through systemic circulation. In general, so you can look at some general rules about what separates or what distinguishes an artery from a vein. We can look at it in terms of where the blood is going. For an artery, blood is always going away from the heart. I always remember arteries are away. Arteries always carry blood away from the heart. And in most cases, in almost every case, blood leaving the heart is going to be oxygen-rich. Now, there is an exception there, and we'll talk about that later on. But in most cases, arteries are carrying oxygen-rich blood away from the heart. They always carry blood away from the heart, and in most cases, that blood is oxygen-rich. Now, when we look at veins, veins are always returning blood back to the heart. And again, in most cases, with all but one exception, blood coming back to the heart is going to be in an oxygen-poor state. But again, the exception we will see here in a little bit. So there's the pathway of blood flow in a four-chambered heart. We have blood coming into the heart through the superior and inferior vena cava. These two are the largest veins in our body. This one up here drains more or less the upper half of the body. Everything above the heart drains into the superior vena cava. And everything more or less below the level of the heart drains through the inferior vena cava. Superior, inferior doesn't mean better or worse. Doesn't mean best and worst. It means this one's above the heart, this one's below the heart. So blood in these two veins is going to go into the right atrium. It's going to flow past what's called a tricuspid valve into the right ventricle. And then from the right ventricle, the blood's going to flow out via the pulmonary artery to the lungs, and where that blood is going to pick up oxygen and drop off carbon dioxide. Blood's then going to return to the heart via the pulmonary veins. So we see pulmonary veins here coming back from the lungs to the heart, and pulmonary veins over here coming back to the heart from the lungs. These pulmonary veins are carrying blood to the heart from the lungs. In both cases, these pulmonary veins back here and these back here are going to return blood into the left atrium of the heart, where it's then going to go into the left ventricle. And what you notice about the left ventricle is that although it's not especially large in terms of volume, it's very, very, very muscular. Very thick wall of cardiac muscle going on here, because the left ventricle is going to pump blood out to the entire rest of the body. The force of blood coming out of the left ventricle has to be substantial enough that the blood that it's moving is going to go to every possible part of the body that needs it. So the blood's going past now the aortic valve, going from the left ventricle out to the rest of the body. This is the overall pathway of blood going, including the heart, the head, the lungs, and the body. Again, we've got right atrium, right ventricle, left atrium, left ventricle. Blood coming through the superior and inferior vena cava go into the left atrium. They go past the tricuspid valve into the right ventricle. From the right ventricle past a pulmonary valve into the pulmonary artery, out to the lungs, picking up oxygen in the lungs, returning back to the left atrium, going past a bicuspid valve into the left ventricle, and then from the left ventricle going out past the aortic valve out to the rest of the body, all to the brain, out to the rest of the body, muscles, organs, everywhere else that needs blood. Blood's coming out of the left ventricle via the aorta out to the rest of the body. The other thing you want to pay attention to in these pictures is color. Right? So blood that is relatively oxygen poor is always going to appear as kind of a bluish color, and blood that's relatively oxygen rich is always going to appear as a reddish color. The blood may not literally be blue or red, but there is certainly a difference in color if blood is relatively oxygen rich versus oxygen poor. Hemoglobin actually changes its intensity of color depending on how much oxygen is present on that molecule. So again, here's kind of the overall structure of our hearts. Right atrium, tricuspid valve, right ventricle. We've got pulmonary arteries, pulmonary veins, left atrium, bicuspid valve, left ventricle. We then have an aortic valve and the aorta. So those are kind of the main structures of our heart. Again, the right side of the heart is equipped to send blood from the heart out to the lungs. The left side of the heart is equipped to receive blood from the lungs and pump it out to the rest of the body. So that's the overall pattern of blood flow. Now, the exceptions I mentioned a few minutes ago, I said that arteries always carry blood away from the heart, and that is true. And I also said that arteries almost always carry oxygen-rich blood, and that is also true. But the one exception there is the pulmonary artery. So if we jump back here to this last picture, the pulmonary artery in this picture is colored blue. Because remember where the blood is coming from in this picture. Blood coming in from the rest of the body. It's given up some of its oxygen. Goes right atrium, tricuspid valve, right ventricle, pulmonary artery. This blood has not yet picked up any oxygen, so it's still a relatively oxygen-poor type of blood. So it's still kind of the bluish color in our picture. This is the one case where arteries are carrying oxygen-poor blood, is the pulmonary artery. I also mentioned previously that veins always carry blood back to the heart, and that blood is almost always oxygen-rich. Again, the pulmonary veins normally carry oxygen-poor blood. Veins almost always carry oxygen-poor blood. I misspoke a second ago. But the pulmonary vein always carries oxygen-rich blood. So arteries carry blood away, typically oxygen-rich, except for the pulmonary artery. Veins carry blood toward the heart, normally oxygen-poor, except for the pulmonary vein. So if we jump back again a second here, the pulmonary veins, which are just kind of peeking out back here, and also over here, these pulmonary veins are color-coded red because they're carrying oxygen-rich blood from the lungs to the right atrium of the heart. Okay, so from the left ventricle then, we're going to pump blood out through the aorta, and from there out to all of the rest of the body tissues, everywhere else in the body. Again, our heart, the mammalian and bird heart, is a four-chambered heart. There are two atria and two ventricles. The ventricle has what's called a septum, or a wall, or a divider that runs right smack dab down through the middle of it that separates the right ventricle from the left ventricle. And so again, we can see a picture here. This is very similar to the one we showed before, with the heart itself, right atrium, right ventricle. We've got pulmonary artery going out to the right lung, pulmonary artery going out to the left lung. Oxygen is being picked up by the blood, so blood goes from being bluish to being reddish, figuratively, back into the left atrium from the left lung, back into the left atrium from the right lung, into the right ventricle, from the right ventricle out into the aorta, which is going to circulate out to the upper half and lower half of the body, respectively. Now, the heart itself is also going to be in need of oxygen-rich blood because it's made of muscle. It's made out of cardiac muscle. And as it's contracting, there is very, very much a need for that cardiac muscle to get oxygen and nutrients because it's going through a lot of those materials. So when you hear about coronary arteries, these are arteries that branch off the aorta almost immediately. So here's the aorta up here, and right away, right as this aorta leaves from the left ventricle, there's a branch here, and there's a branch over here. And those are the coronary arteries that are going to initially branch off and start to supply the heart with oxygen and nutrients. If those coronary arteries become blocked for some reason, such that blood flow can't get through them as much as it should, then you're going to deal with the beginnings of starving cardiac muscle for oxygen and nutrients. And that's the beginnings of what you call a heart attack. There are also coronary veins. So we have to get blood, once it's given up some of the oxygen to the cardiac muscle, we have to get blood back into the heart. And so the coronary veins are going to take blood into the right atrium, just like any vein eventually leads into the right atrium. So cardiac muscle itself, we've looked at this before. We saw this back in our chapter on animal tissues and animal organization. Cardiac muscle is made up of cells that are branching as opposed to being straight. There are striations. There are visible lines present in cardiac muscle. They are typically single nucleus muscle cells, and they are, of course, involuntary. So you don't control contraction of cardiac muscle by thinking about it like you would your arms or your legs, right? We also have the striations, which are the result of those intercalated discs. We saw that again back in the chapter on animal organization and tissues. These are connections between cells that allow for very, very rapid communication among cells. So rather than having the plasma membranes completely wall off the cells, now we have a connection between the cells that's very efficient and allows for movement of messages to travel from one cell to the next, to the next, to the next. In the case of the heart, that's especially important because when our cardiac muscle cells contract, we want them to all contract at the same time so the heart actually works like a single functional pump, as opposed to all the cells kind of contracting whenever they feel like it. If that's the case, you go into a situation which is called fibrillation, where the heart begins to quiver and shake, and it's not really the kind of situation where blood can actually move out of the heart, and of course that's not really where you want to be. So again, these are cardiac cells. They have branches to them. They have this one has a trunk, followed by 3 branches. This one has 2 branches on each end. Single nucleus. There are striations here again, and those striations are the result of gap junctions. As far as the valves are concerned in the heart, I mentioned these previously. There's a pair of what are called atrioventricular valves, which is a kind of a big, fancy sounding name. But if you think about the name and you think about where they occur, the name actually really makes a lot of sense. The atrioventricular valves are the valves that separate each atrium from its respective ventricle. So on the right side of the heart, we have what's called the tricuspid valve. The tricuspid valve is what separates the right atrium from the right ventricle, and more importantly, prevents backflow of blood. So when the atria contracts, the tricuspid valve is going to open up. As pressure increases in the right atrium, the tricuspid valve opens up, blood passes through it into the right ventricle, and then when the right atrium relaxes, the tricuspid valve slams shut, kind of like a screen door that you open and then let go of it. It's sort of a self-closing valve that prevents blood from flowing back into the atrium once the atrium has relaxed. So it's kind of a self-closing mechanism that helps prevent backflow of blood. On the left side of the heart, we have what's called the bicuspid or mitral valve. This is going to separate the left atrium from the left ventricle. And again, the idea is the same. As the left atrium contracts and pressure goes up, blood is forced from the right atrium to the right ventricle. The bicuspid valve is going to open as long as pressure is high. That valve opens up. When pressure in the right atrium drops, that valve is going to close itself, slam shut, and prevent backflow of blood from the left ventricle into the left atrium. The other pair of valves are called semilunar valves. And there's a pair of these, one leaving from the right ventricle, the other one leaving from the left ventricle. So again, the idea here is we want to have a one-way path flow of blood. We do not want backflow. We don't want backwashing of blood back into any chamber of any kind. So the pulmonary valve is going to be the exit of the right ventricle, going from the right ventricle to the pulmonary artery. There is a valve which prevents backflow into the right ventricle once the right ventricle relaxes. On the left side of the heart, there's what's called the aortic valve, which separates the left ventricle from the aorta. So when the left ventricle contracts, the aortic valve opens up because pressure is high. Blood leaves the left ventricle, but then when the left ventricle relaxes, the aortic valve is going to close and prevent backflow of blood from the aorta into the left ventricle. So again, kind of self-closing like a screen door. All right, so we're going to stop here, and we will talk about the cardiac cycle, which is a bit more involved. So we want to kind of make this its own section. So I'm going to cut this off here for now.